In the middle of the 1979 election campaign, the outgoing Prime Minister, Jim Callaghan, turned to his special advisor, Bernard Donoughue, and said, "There's a sea change taking place in British politics, and there's nothing I can say or do about it." Callaghan, in a much quoted phrase, was reflecting on deeper tidal waves, which in his view were going to propel him out of power. He wasn't talking about the then leader of the opposition, Margaret Thatcher, but deeper currents. He was speaking after a traumatic, energy-draining 3 years as Prime Minister, particularly traumatic for Jim Callaghan because it ended with the so-called winter of discontent, where unions were defying his attempt to impose a pay policy, causing a degree of mayhem, became famously known as the winter of discontent. Traumatic for Callaghan because he was a friend of the unions. He felt he would have a rapport with them beyond previous leaders, but in the end he fell in the context, once again, of a Prime Minister struggling to deal with the trade unions. And to answer the question, to what degree was this a sea change, we need to go back quite a long way into the 1970s to see whether it was more to do with the will and personality of Margaret Thatcher or to do with the global currents that Callaghan felt so powerfully propelling him out of power. And to answer that question about the sea change, we have to ask another one, which is this. There were 3 prime ministers that ruled during those turbulent 1970s, all very different. 1 a Tory and 2 Labour. Ted Heath, from June 1970 to February 1974. Harold Wilson came in after that, back in power, unexpectedly, between February 74 and October 76. And then finally, Callaghan. Very different types. Heath, publicly awkward, sometimes stubborn figure, but someone who had a kind of decency which the unions in particular, or some of them, could relate to, bizarrely in the light of what happened to him. Wilson, then a tired figure, back in power amidst more economic turbulence, and then Callaghan. Yet they all moved towards their doom in the same way. Each of them began opposing a policy which they knew wouldn't work, would bring darkness upon them and others. And yet at each key point in their premiership, they adopted that policy. Watching the premierships of Heath, Wilson and Callaghan, it's like watching some dark film noir where someone is drawn knowingly towards their doom. Let me briefly go through each of them because it provides the context to that 79 election campaign which transformed Britain and British politics. First of all, Heath. He arrived unexpectedly in power in June 1970. Many thought Harold Wilson would win that election. And he was resolved to take a different approach to industrial relations, the great thorn in British politics. He came in saying they wouldn't support lame ducks, that sort of corporatism had failed. He was totally against a pay and incomes policy. He thought it would be stifling and counterproductive. Within 2 years, Heath introduced a complex pay and incomes policy. He felt he had no choice but to do so, and it was the pay and incomes policy that brought him down. His method was to introduce a phase 1, a phase 2 and phase 3, which had a certain rational logic to it. Heath often thought in rational and logical terms, but not in emotional politics. It gave him far too many hurdles to climb. And the unions confidently defied each phase, actually, but most spectacularly the final phase. He began with a pay freeze and then graded pay rises. There was a price freeze too. This was corporatism in action in the 70s. The unions defied it. There was a 3-day week when the miners were on strike. Heath called an election saying who governs, and the answer came back, not you. Wilson in that election campaign mocked Heath for having this incomes policy. He said they didn't work. He would introduce a social contract. That would be a voluntary arrangement between the government and the unions. The government would deliver on some economic and social policies, and the unions would exercise voluntary restraint. It was one of the reasons why Wilson unexpectedly got back into power. He knew deep down these incomes policies didn't work. Within a year, and by the way, during that year, Jim Callaghan, then Foreign Secretary, said incomes and prices policies were a dead duck. We were going to have nothing to do with them. He said that at the Labour Party conference in the autumn of 1974. Like Heath, these latest characters in the film noir adopted, in effect, a pay policy. Under Wilson, it was clever, characteristically so. It was theoretically voluntary because Wilson couldn't lose entirely face in his opposition to incomes policy, but it was backed up with statutory emergency powers to impose the policy if the unions didn't do it voluntarily. So in effect, it was one. For Wilson, the strain of imposing this and facing resistance was one of the factors, I think, that made him decide to go in October 76. He said in his farewell interviews, the same old problems keep on coming back again and again, and they demand fresh thinking. In came Jim Callaghan, the figure who had spoken up for the unions when the last Labour government in 1968 tried to impose, in place of strife, a series of union reforms. Jim was their friend, and he thought he would have a rapport with union leaders that would guide Britain towards a more stable place. But instead, the same issues began to arise. Inflation out of control, wages having therefore to go up to meet the rising inflation. And Jim Callaghan, who in 1974 had described incomes policy as a dead duck, introduced one. Knowingly, once more, moving towards his doom with a policy that had brought down Ted Heath and contributed to the fall of Harold Wilson. He too introduced a pay policy, and the unions defied it again. And once more, he fell over the failure to make the pay policy work. This begs a question: why was it that intelligent, experienced prime ministers, they were all much more experienced, those three, than the three who were to become prime ministers, why did they do it? Knowingly walking towards their doom. And here I think we learn one of the great lessons of politics, that when sea changes are coming, politicians rarely see them. They look to the past for guidance rather than the future. And these three prime ministers were guided by their political upbringing, which was the 1930s, the period where mass unemployment caused great social and economic dislocation. And those three prime ministers were brought up on the assumption, they didn't even need to state it, they just knew it, that mass unemployment was a social evil and a cause of great economic hardship. And so they, each of them, would move heaven and earth to stop that from happening. The most traumatic period of Heath's period in power was when unemployment rose above 1 million. He thought the country would not be able to sustain it and panicked. Wilson and Callaghan similarly. Towards the end of his life, I did a long interview with Jim Callaghan. He was in the House of Lords then. And he said to me in an interesting way that that was their political upbringing, the 1930s. And they didn't see the changes that were taking place in front of them. It's a common characteristic of politicians. No one knows what's going to happen next, but we do have a past to guide us. It's a treacherous guide. Arguably, in the financial crash in 2008, you could say that David Cameron and George Osborne looked back to the past for guidance. George Osborne quite explicitly spoke to Nigel Lawson, a chancellor in the 1980s, and some of his responses to the 2008 crash were guided by the politics and economics of that decade, for good or bad. But he looked back, and we often do, even though the circumstances are new. And while these three prime ministers, conditioned by the 1930s, responding with good instincts, but in some cases calamitous outcomes to the trials and tribulations of that decade, Margaret Thatcher sat, watched, and spoke very loudly. She did so in an incredibly complex context. Let me just give you one example of the complexity. The miners' strike under the Heath government caused a degree of mayhem. Britain was down to a 3-day week, TV stations closed at 10 o'clock in the evening and all the rest of it. One of the supporters of that miners' strike was Enoch Powell, one of Thatcher's early admirers, and she admired him. And he argued that after the quadrupling of the oil price in the Middle East, another seismic shock to the British economy, that happened in the autumn of 1973, along with all the other dramas, the market value of the miners here in the United Kingdom had soared. And on market grounds alone, they deserved a significant pay rise. And yet, it was the turbulence of the Heath period that partly defined Margaret Thatcher. She sat there as Education Secretary during the Heath government, relatively quiet, loyal to him. But afterwards, when elected in 1975, began to chart a different course. There is no doubt that she, if there was a sea change, propelled the tides to some extent herself from the very beginning. She was a very different kind of leader of the opposition. While Jim Callaghan and Harold Wilson were struggling with these day-to-day dramas, mainly to do with the unions, but all kinds of other things as well, she was unusual in that she was fascinated by ideas and speaking out. She gave a whole series of interviews in the 1970s when she was leader of the opposition to people like, there was a program on in the United States hosted by a Republican thinker, William Buckley, very influential figure on Reagan. She liked nothing more to go over and engage with Buckley live on American television about ideas, the degree to which Hayek spelled out a different route, the degree to which he recognized, in her view, that the state was a stifling agency and that the key to freedom was a smaller state and lower taxes. She was gripped by ideas and the way they related to policy. And that is at odds with the caution of most leaders of the opposition. She was cautious in some respects, but there was a different figure on the political stage. Some of those who argue that the sea change went much deeper point to some of the things that Callaghan himself did in the late 70s. For example, in a famous party conference speech written by his then son-in-law, Peter Jay, it was Cameron who said It was Callaghan, Cameron comes later, Jim Callaghan, who said, "You cannot spend your way out of a recession." And that did appear to mark a shift away from the Keynesian policies that various Labour governments had sort of embraced. And this is often cited as one example of many that really this change that happened in '79 was less to do with Margaret Thatcher than the broader context. And that if, say, Labour had won in '79, there would have been similar pressures on public spending and all the rest of it. That is partly true. Callaghan was trying to navigate his way through this deeply traumatic period, uncertain of which ideological levers to press. But it wasn't the case that Callaghan was in any way adopting monetarism. This was something that gripped Margaret Thatcher and her then Shadow Chancellor Geoffrey Howe as part of a whole range of ways in which they wanted to move the economy in a different direction if they won. Callaghan was speaking partly to justify the huge spending cuts that the International Monetary Fund had imposed on the Labour government in return for a loan. And he was also speaking partly out of this traumatised experience that the more they spent, the more inflation went up, and he was trying to make sense of it with the economist Peter Jay. But it was a very different set of values that shaped Callaghan's approach to the economy than the one that drove Margaret Thatcher. In the late 70s, the Conservative Party too was struggling with the sea change. Many of Margaret Thatcher's senior shadow cabinet colleagues were deeply wary of some of the changes and some of her instincts in all these areas. People like Jim Pryor, her employment spokesman, was part of the film noir that had gripped, trapped Wilson, Heath and Callaghan. He still put the case for an incomes policy, and she didn't want one. And they waffled their way round this evasively for quite some time. The monetarist policy that excited Geoffrey Howe and her, controlling the monetary supply as a way of addressing inflation, worried many of the economic policy experts in her shadow cabinet. But there is no doubt that in the build-up to that '79 election, she acquired more personal confidence as it looked possibly that she was going to win. You always, as a leader of the opposition, begin to acquire authority as it looks as if you are indeed the next Prime Minister. And here we have to forget about the tidal wave of change and look at the micro. In the late summer of 1978, many expected Jim Callaghan to call an election. And Labour at that point, in spite of the trauma of the winter of discontent, were slightly ahead in the polls. Jim Callaghan decided not to call it. It's one of the interesting things about prime ministers. There is always speculation that they might call an election, that they might resign, that they might be forced out. But on the whole, prime ministers tend to cling on and hope that something better will turn up. And that was Jim Callaghan's thinking in September 1978. He looked around and quite enjoyed being Prime Minister in spite of all the traumas and felt that something might turn up. And wholly unexpectedly, with the Conservative Party ready to launch their manifesto, Jim Callaghan went on to television with a party election broadcast in which many thought he was going to announce this election and said he wasn't going to hold one. And that decision, rather than enhancing Callaghan's authority, undermined it. And he looked weaker from that moment on, and she began to look stronger. The polls started moving in her direction, and things started to go terribly wrong for Callaghan and the Labour government, as ever, in the area of industrial relations. And as her authority grew, she became bolder in her ambition for what she would want to do. It is true that, as I reflected in the series when we were looking at modern prime ministers, there were many elements of her early leadership that were marked by caution and expediency. But if you look at the 79 manifesto, it was pretty bold. It hinted at tax cuts to be paid for, income tax cuts to be paid for by rises in VAT. Didn't spell it out, but that was the clear hint. It was in that 79 manifesto that there was the proposition for council house sales. There was also tonally an extraordinary personal message from Margaret Thatcher, in which she spoke about the stifling corporatism of that last decade and her belief in freedom by letting people get on with their lives without the state interfering so much. People like Michael Heseltine, who are no great fans of Margaret Thatcher, say she got her beliefs partly through sort of anecdote and her parents and bumping into people, but combined it sometimes, and this is when he said she was more powerful, with sort of intellectual ideas, Friedman and Hayek being the main ones. Along with her increasingly willful and confident leadership, her shadow chancellor Geoffrey Howe had already written his first budget before he even walked into the Treasury. And of course, when he was Chancellor, he delivered it very dramatically soon after that 79 election. So they were ready. And when the election came, it was in appropriately dramatic circumstances, appropriate for a decade of turbulence where three prime ministers could never really keep control, where the levers of corporatism, which they knew weren't working, they continued to pull in an attempt to bring about a change that was never going to happen, and they knew it was never going to happen. It came in the most dramatic of circumstances because by then Jim Callaghan had lost his overall majority. It was always very small. He did a deal with the Liberals for part of the Parliament, but at the end, each vote was a knife edge. And they had a vote following the failure of that government's devolution proposals, a vote of no confidence. Nobody knew the outcome. It was going to be incredibly close. And the leader of the House, Michael Foot, gave a very entertaining speech full of jokes. I think he just decided there's nothing anyone else can do about this. It's in the fate and hands of the whips. I'm going to have a good time for about half an hour. But the tension as he joked his way towards the final division was palpable. And then the vote was announced and Callaghan had lost. One of the few prime ministers to lose a vote of confidence and be forced to hold an election. And he stood at the dispatch box and said, "We will now take our case to the country." The final words uttered by a Labour prime minister at a dispatch box for 18 years. There clearly was a profound sea change to keep a party out of power for that period of time. And over time, and it was over time, Margaret Thatcher followed the waves but also generated some herself. For example, other European countries who had rejected corporatism didn't all embrace Thatcherism. Thatcherism was close in some ways to Reaganite United States policies, but less close to, say, the way Germany was responding to the tidal waves around the world, or indeed France, which was having its own traumas. She was unique in her approach to government, in her attitude. There was no incomes policy under her. She saw the Heath U-turn. She wasn't going to do it. Over time, with the miners' strike that she defeated after a long, long period in the mid-1980s, the entire relationship with government and trade unions had been transformed. She didn't invite them into number 10. In contrast, when, say, Harold Wilson resigned in October 1976, one of the first people he told was the General Secretary of the TUC. The other changes are well known. Over time, the privatisation of many state-owned industries, the Big Bang, the lighter regulatory framework. It was an entirely different approach. Some of it might well have happened anyway, under any circumstance. But there is no doubt that many of the changes were also a product of her style of leadership. And for the Labour Party too, it underwent its own sea change. The trauma of defeat and the trauma of that 5 years in government meant for a time it went to the left. Jim Callaghan stayed on, probably too long, and then Michael Foot became its leader. And almost as a counter march to Margaret Thatcher, changed his party's policies to back unilateral nuclear disarmament, to oppose Britain's membership of the European Union, to advocate a much greater role for state ownership, and Keynesianism fully restored post-Callaghan, a big programme of public spending too. And that, in its turn, generated a schism within the Labour Party, which we will explore in another talk. It was another major turning point. So I think when we reflect on 79 and Callaghan's comment that this was a sea change over which there was nothing that can be done about it, he was partly right. There were global currents which those brought up in the 1930s were ill-equipped to deal with. But it was also about her. When Ted Heath lost the leadership contest to Margaret Thatcher in early 1975, when the ballot result was announced, Heath looked up and said to his close advisor at the time, William Waldegrave, later to become a minister, "It's over." Two characteristically abrupt words. And Waldegrave interpreted it in two different ways. Heath meant it was over for him and his career, but he meant something else as well, prophetically. It was over for his side of the Tory party. The one nation Toryism of Macmillan, Rab Butler, and indeed Heath was over with that ballot. He would regard that as a threat, probably, to Margaret Thatcher, who he never forgave. But in some ways it was a compliment too, because he could see that along with the sea change, there was a figure ready to ride the tides.